And our presenter today is Marc Frank. He's the extension botanist for IFAS. He works at the Museum of Natural History at the Herbarium. He serves commercial and residential audiences. His specialties are plant identification, botany instruction, toxic plants, and exotic invasive plants. And Marc has worked for the University of Florida for many years off and on. He's also worked for the state of Florida Ag Department and the Department of Plant Industry, and as well has former stints at our Smithsonian Museum up in DC, as well as the Singapore Botanical Gardens. And Marc is amazing resource for us, truly an expert in botany and plant identification, as well as being a Alachua County Master Gardener, and just an all-around wonderful person. So Marc, I'm thrilled that you're here today to talk about asters, and I'm going to go ahead and stop share, and I'm going to let you introduce your topic.
Cool. Okay, well, while I share screen, there it is. Okay, hopefully everyone can see this shared screen. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. I am very happy to see that there are 294 participants, though I have to tell you that I heard from Emily that for fire ants, there are almost 500 participants, or maybe more than 500. So I'm slightly shocked that fire ants are more interesting than asters. Who would think? But maybe it's just because it's so nice outside today, everyone's got to be outside, right, and doesn't want to learn about asters. And of course, these are recorded, so you'll be able to, right, Wendy, are we recording?
Absolutely. Yep. It'll be posted.
Recording, so there is a chance for people to see it. So if someone tells you that they missed the webinar today, you can remind them that they're recorded and available on the webinar website. So today I am going to talk about the Asteraceae, the Aster family. And this family name comes from the genus Aster. You can see the type species for that genus, the Italian or Michaelmas daisy, which grows in Europe. We don't really grow it very well here in the US. And so this was the species on which Linnaeus based the genus Aster, and the genus Aster is what gives the name to the family, Asteraceae. But we also call it the daisy family, the sunflower family. There's a bunch of genera in the family, as we'll mention. So you might hear someone refer to it as the goldenrod family, or the ragweed family, and those are all perfectly acceptable. Also, you should know that for certain plant families, there are alternative family names. There are, according to the Code of Botanical Nomenclature, about a dozen families that have approved alternate names, and Aster family is one of them. So the alternate name is Compositae. Particularly in European and older publications, you'll often see that name being used instead of Asteraceae, but no, it's the same thing, referring to the same family. And that name Compositae refers to a really important factor that we're going to cover, which tells you that what looks like a single flower is actually a composite structure, an inflorescence consisting of many tiny flowers. And we're going to cover that in detail today. So the first thing you should know is that the Aster family is huge. It's the second largest family of flowering plants in the entire world. There are over 1,600 genera and about 24,700 species. And this accounts for 10% of all the flowering plant species in the world. So 1/10 of all flowering plants in the world belong to the Aster family. And not only is it huge worldwide, but it's huge in Florida too. It's also our second largest flowering plant family in the state. with about 140 genera and 440 species, and that includes both species that are native to Florida, as well as the exotic species that have been introduced and become established in the wild. So just as a refresher, here are the rankings on the left side of the screen for the largest families in the world, and on the right, the largest families in Florida. And so what you'll see is worldwide, the largest family is the orchid family, but it is just slightly larger than the Aster family. And as I'm going to mention in a few minutes, there are some estimates that there may actually be as many as 35,000 species of asters, in which case the Aster family would overtake the orchid family as the largest family in the world, the largest flowering plant family. What you'll notice here is in Florida, the orchid family is actually number 5, and our biggest family is the grass family, the Poaceae. And so this will probably be something that I'll suggest as a Master Gardener webinar topic in the future, because I think it's really important for you guys to start to familiarize yourselves with these big families that you will be most likely to encounter in the wild or in a garden setting. So just, you can see this, but to just run through worldwide, the orchid family is number 1, the Aster family number 2, the legume family is number 3. Interestingly, the Rubiaceae is number 4 worldwide and doesn't even show up in the Florida top 5. And that's because the Rubiaceae really has its primary diversity in the true tropics. So the equatorial regions of both the New World and the Old World, and that's why we don't have nearly as many Rubiaceae here in Florida. And then the grass family rounds out at number 5 worldwide. But what I want you to notice is that in terms of worldwide rankings, 2 families, the orchids and the asters, are an order of magnitude, not really an order of magnitude, but there's almost 10,000 more of those than there are of the legumes. So these 2 families are considered the mega diverse flowering plant families worldwide. And so we're going to have a talk on Orchidaceae eventually too.
Hey, Mark, I've got a good question. Diane wants to know, of the 440 species, are those all natives, or do those include the non-natives?
No, it's native and naturalized. That's the ones that are escaped into the wild, but not any cultivated. Is that clear? So it's probably about 300 and something native, and then additional introduced and established.
Okay.
Now here in Florida, our biggest family is the grass family, followed by the asters, the legumes, the sedge family, and then the orchid family. Okay, so here in Florida, the biggest genera in the Aster family that you will encounter is our Symphyiotrichum. The Symphyiotrichums used to be known as the genus Aster, but what happened is they found out that in terms of genetics, that the old world asters, the ones that Linnaeus used to define the genus, were really distinct from the New World asters. And so the New World asters got busted up into a bunch of other genera. So the primary ones that we see here in Florida are Symphyiotrichum. Then the other big genera here in Florida, the goldenrods in the genus Solidago, the sunflowers in the genus Helianthus, the thoroughworts or bonesets in the genus Eupatorium, the gay feathers in the genus Liatris, and our state wildflower, the Coreopsis or tick seeds. These are the biggest genera of the Aster family here in the state of Florida, and you can do the math and add these up. These 6 genera account for a good over 100 of our native species. So another really important thing for you to remember, besides the fact that the Aster family is huge, is that they occur almost everywhere. So on this map, the areas that are orange are areas where the Aster family occurs. So what you'll see is it is only in the very far reaches of the Arctic and the Antarctic where you don't have the Aster family. And even just 15 years ago, most publications on the Aster family would say no Asteraceae in Antarctica at all. But in 2010, a publication came out that on a little tiny island that is considered part of Antarctica, just about here, about 950 kilometers south of the tip of South America, it is called Deception Island in Antarctica, and they discovered 2 species of Asteraceae there. They're not really sure if those 2 species got there by natural means, like wind or on the feathers of birds, or if they were introduced by people. So they're kind of investigating that. But interestingly, one of those genera that they found is a type of Gammakita or cudweed. And I'm sure you guys know cudweed as a weed in your yard. So even in Antarctica, there is cudweed. There is no escaping it. But just remember, asters throughout the world, but they are particularly diverse in arid to semi-arid habitats. So these include deserts, prairies, steppes, drier montane regions, and areas with a Mediterranean climate, which would include the southern part, the southwestern part of South America, the southern part of Africa, parts of Australia, and of course, California. And all those areas have fairly moderate year-round temperatures. Their rainfall tends to be winter rainfall and drier summers, and the asters thrive under those conditions. Okay, so I cannot give a presentation without giving a cladogram. A cladogram is a diagram that shows evolutionary relationships between families. And the reason why I think this is so important is because this is what is happening in botany now. We are witnessing that names of plants that we know are changing, and a lot of this is because of a reassessment of the evolutionary relationships between plants. And we're realizing that sometimes our names do not accurately reflect evolutionary relationships. So in every presentation, I try to include some cladograms so you can start to get familiar with this concept that botanists are really reclassifying and re-examining the diversity of plants in our world in an attempt to really reflect natural categories that are evolutionarily related. So in this case, in this cladogram, you can just think of it as a tree. And on the right, you see a number of plant families. And here at the very bottom, we see our spotlight subject, the Aster family. And what you're probably going to notice is when you read through most of these names, you're like, I have never heard of these. And it's with good reason. Most of these are relatively small families that only occur in Australia or South America. They're not represented in Florida or in North America at all. The only exception is the Bellflower family, the Capitulum. This includes our lobelias that we love to grow. The many Anthaceae, we have a few representatives like the floating hearts, nymphoides. We have a couple of native nymphoides and a couple of introduced nymphoides that grow here in Florida. The Goodeniaceae, which is primarily an Australian family, but we have a couple representatives in Florida that are in the genus Scaevola, the fan flowers. And so you've probably seen these, particularly if you live near the coast, you've seen we have an invasive Scaevola and also a native Scaevola that grow on the beaches. And then there's this family, the Caliceraceae, that is only in South America. And so these three families, the Nymphoides and their relatives, the Scaevolas and their relatives, the Caliceras and their relatives, these are the kin, the closest relatives to the Asteraceae. These other families at the top of the screen are more distantly related. Now, what we see in this order, Asteraceae overall, is a unique method of presenting pollen to the environment, and that is called plunger pollination, where instead of the male parts presenting the pollen to pollinators, it is the female parts that catch the pollen from a tube and bring it out and expose it to the environment. And I'm going to talk more about that, but know that in this order, Asteraceae, there is a trend towards plunger pollination, and there is also a trend towards the inflorescence, instead of being stretched out and elongated and branched, to becoming increasingly more dense and compact, like you were seeing in this Caliceraceae picture down at the bottom. Okay, another mind-numbing.
Mark, I got a question for you.
Okay.
D. Hackett wants to know, is the evolutionary process or progress, are y'all using DNA for that now? And
it's everything.
Okay.
Okay, so when we're talking about classification, the most reliable hypotheses of classification rely on multiple lines of evidence. And so that will include DNA, studies of whole genomes, chemical analysis, as well as morphological analysis. So people always think that it's just DNA that's creating all these changes in names and classifications, but really it's multiple lines of evidence that are being brought together. And I'm going to talk about some of those lines of evidence in this presentation. So I'm going to talk some about chemistry, I'm going to talk some about morphology, as well as DNA.
Okay, and real quick, Janice wants to know, how are you defining a montane region?
A montane, there's not really a good single, a montane region would be something with altitude. So basically, I mean, think mountain, it's a mountainous region.
Okay, somewhere up there. Okay.
Yeah,
thanks, Mark.
It's a general term, as opposed to lowland, coastal. Piedmont would be transitional, and montane would be upland. Okay, so it's just general terms. Okay, so we talked about relationships of the Aster family to other families. Now let's talk about relationships within the Aster family. So here you see another cladogram. You don't need to read it. I can hardly read it, even with my reading glasses. Just know that what you're seeing on the right are a number of different groupings within the family that are known as tribes. Okay? Right now, as I said, currently recognized, there's somewhere 24,700 to 25,000 species recognized. But as I previously mentioned, some botanists estimate there could be as many as 35,000 species in the Aster family. And when you have that many species, it is really hard to classify and make sense of what's related to what. And so the traditional scheme that has been used was developed by a French botanist named Henri Cassini, who worked in the early 1800s studying the Asteraceae, and he divided them into groupings called tribes. And that traditional concept of tribal classification has been used ever since Cassini's time. Now, since Cassini died at a young age in the 1830s, he was 52 years old. But since Cassini's time, people have disagreed how many tribes are there and what species go into what tribes. So there's been all this back and forth in terms of how many tribes and what goes where. But current phylogenies or classification systems recognize roughly 30 tribes. And so that is what you see arrayed on the right side of this cladogram is most of the 30 tribes. And then those 30 tribes are further grouped together based on their evolutionary relationships into subfamilies. And so currently there are about a dozen subfamilies within the Aster family, and those are represented in this cladogram by color. So what you'll see is there are a whole bunch that are violet, and those are the subfamily Asteroideae, which contains 17,000 species, or about 70% of the family. Asteraceae all belongs to this one subfamily, then consisting of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, somewhere 12 or more tribes. You can see the other big families here include the ironweeds, the vernonias, and the thistle subfamily up here. Those are the three big subfamilies. So again, it's not important that you remember this, but just to start to get familiar with how botanists conceptualize and work with the process of plant classification. Okay. This is such a mind-numbing yet incredibly cool diagram that I had to include it. So again, this is a cladogram showing evolutionary relationships. And on the right side, you see all the different tribes within the Aster family arranged. So it's basically showing you the relationship between the different tribes, but on the lower axis, you're seeing time from the late Cretaceous at about 100 million years ago on the left side to recent on the right side. And then superimposed onto that, you have geography color-coded. So orange is the southern part of South America. You have the Andean region and kind of that flesh color, Brazil in that fuchsia, Africa in the deep blue, Northern Africa in light blue, and so on. So what you're able to see from this slide is that the Aster family, the earliest records of the Aster family, see how they're all the same color as South America. So the family originated in South America in the late Cretaceous period, about 85 million years ago. And this is based on fossil evidence as well as DNA evidence. And what happened is over time, look at this. So this is the oldest, and we're going from that kind of orangey color, and then we're getting the kind of flesh color. So we're seeing it migrated towards the northern part of South America into Brazil, and then we start to get North America yellow, right? So it was basically started evolving here in the southern part of South America, gradually moved northward, and then in the Eocene area, you see all this blue. And so there was an explosive radiation of the Aster family on the African continent between 45 and 25 million years ago. And then lastly, what I want you to notice is North America is yellow. And Central America is this dark brown. And so what we notice is in that super big subfamily that I mentioned, the Asteroideae subfamily, there was this amazing radiation of it during the Miocene era. And this was happening primarily in North America and Central America, in a lesser extent in South America. So it starts off in Southern South America, moves northward, big radiation in Africa, and then relatively late in evolutionary history, then there's a big spread in North America. Okay, enough of evolution. Let's talk about chemistry. The Asteraceae is super rich in a whole variety of chemical compounds, and the most ubiquitous are these bitter compounds that are called sesquiterpene lactones. They occur in at least 75 or 80% of the Aster family. So think about chicory or endive or escarole, or when your lettuce starts to bolt, they've all got that bitter flavor. That is a classic sign of sesquiterpene lactones. The other chemical group that's super common is the coumarins. So think about the smell of blue mist flower or vanilla leaf, or some of the other members of this family that have that kind of spicy vanilla aroma. There's a whole group of different chemical compounds that are super common. And these compounds are usually produced either by latex cells or resin cells. So think about when you pick lettuce or you cut off the stalk, you'll notice how it bleeds that milky latex. Or you cut down some wild lettuce or some other weedy Asteraceae like a fireweed, and you'll see milky latex. So latex is very common in the Aster family, and resin compounds are too. So think about something like saltbush, Baccharis, or Rudbeckia, the coneflowers. When you look at the leaves close up with a hand lens, you'll actually see resin cells embedded in the leaves. And those resin cells are going to give the leaves an aromatic fragrance. Now, the purpose to all of these chemical compounds is primarily to deter herbivores, both insects that are trying to eat the plant, but also to a lesser extent, vertebrate herbivores like deer or other grazers. But also, really interestingly, a lot of these chemical compounds are antimicrobial, so they will affect fungi or bacteria that are starting to colonize and invade the plant tissue. And then lastly, these chemical compounds provide a competitive advantage to the plant by discouraging the growth of other plants nearby, which is called allelopathy. So this whole host of chemical compounds are contained in the Aster family that basically give them a suite of competitive advantages in terms of surviving herbivory, discouraging pathogens, and outcompeting other plants. And the other thing you should know about this chemistry is so many of these compounds are biologically active, which means they have medicinal applications. They're very commonly used in traditional herbal medicine. When taken at an uncontrolled dose or indiscriminately, they are potentially poisonous. So a number of Asteraceae can be poisonous to livestock when they graze on them. Though I should note with those sesquiterpene lactones, which are bitter, often livestock won't graze on this family. And the other thing about the Asteraceae chemistry is that it is of great interest to the pharmacological industry, the drug industry. So they are constantly investigating the bioactivity of all these compounds within the Aster family and studying them as potential sources of therapeutic drugs. So Asteraceae has a very interesting chemistry. And one last point, I got to get on, but one last point is people have done classifications based on the chemical contents of various Asteraceae and laid it over the DNA and morphological data to refine the cladograms like the ones that I showed you on the preceding slide. So this chemistry, what chemical compounds show up in what plants, contributes to our classification. Okay, the Asteraceae has many, many different forms. They are mostly non-woody and fairly low growing, but there are some woody species, those would be trees and shrubs, For example, this super cool tree cabbage that occurs on an island off the coast of Chile. This is a good sized tree. We're talking, look, it's almost as tall as the roof behind it. So we're talking 20 feet tall with these big pom-pom flowers. And yes, they call it tree cabbage because the leaves are edible as a vegetable. Wouldn't you love to be able to grow this in your yard? But unfortunately, it wants Mediterranean climate, so we'll hate Florida, but I had to have an excuse to throw in the tree cabbage. So there are some freaky, woody representatives of the Aster family. Think about our saltbush baccharis, that's woody. And there are some more montane tree daisies that those of you who live in South Florida sometimes see. That's the genus Montanoa that have big white and yellow daisy flowers. And so you'll see those sometime, but overwhelmingly, the family is non-woody. Also, overwhelmingly, the family is terrestrial. They grow on the land. But interestingly, there are at least 20 species that are epiphytic, which means they grow up in trees rather than on the ground. And there are even aquatic species of Asteraceae. We have one species, Scleropus, the pink bog button here in Florida, which is an aquatic member of the Asteraceae. So not strictly terrestrial, there are some aquatic and epiphytic species as well. The life cycle is variable, so there are annual species, biennial, and perennial. And we talked about that big radiation in Africa of the Asteraceae, particularly in arid parts of Africa. There are a whole bunch of succulent species that evolved. And so in the succulent enthusiast group, and those of you who are succulent enthusiasts know who you are. I count myself in the club. There are a bunch of cool members of the Asteraceae, and I'm going to show you a couple of them later on. Okay, in terms of leaf morphology, Asteraceae is super variable, so you can get an idea of the range of variation from this slide. You may remember, if you've seen my Botany 101 presentation, that certain plant families have those little structures called stipules that protect the leaves when they're in bud. Asteraceae doesn't have stipules, never has stipules. As a matter of fact, as far as I know, none of the Asteraceae, the whole order, lacks stipules. So if you have something that has stipules, you know it's not going to be Asteraceae or Asteraceae. The leaf arrangement, that is how the leaves are positioned along the stem, can be alternate, it can be opposite, or whorled. So that means sometimes there's one leaf at a node, sometimes there's two leaves at a node opposite one another, and sometimes you have 3 or more leaves at a node. So you see all of this variation, and sometimes you see a basal rosette. So with this Gerber Daisy and the slide above, you can see how the plants are forming a rosette of leaves right along the ground. And then this Gerber Daisy stays low, but with some other plants, they will initially form a basal rosette and then elongate to flower. So you'll see that, for example, in a lot of our goldenrods. The leaves are typically simple rather than compound. So they're not consisting of a bunch of leaflets. They are simple, but sometimes they are really divided so they look like a compound leaf. So in this example here, you might interpret that as looking like compound, but it's just deeply pinnately lobed. Or here with this Tithonia, you can see that it is palmately lobed. Sometimes aster leaves have a stalk, a petiole, and sometimes they don't. So here you can see a petiole in that Tithonia leaf and in this leaf, but then when you look at this sow thistle here, you can see it's sessile. It doesn't have a stalk. And the same with this goldenrod, this solidago up here, it's a sessile leaf. So very variable. And then look at the leaf margins. They're all over the place. Sometimes they're smooth and entire. They can be scalloped. They can be toothed, they can be lobed. So you get all of this variation in the margins and the veins. So there is no one or two good vegetative characters for recognizing the Aster family. You've got to rely on floral characteristics as well as chemistry. So this takes us straight on to flowers. I mentioned that the alternate name for the Asteraceae is Compositae. Compositae, because what appears to be a single flower, this daisy head, is actually a composite structure of many tiny flowers. And so from this cross section, you can start to see individual disc flowers making up the center and ray flowers on the outside, and they're all attached to an extension of the peduncle. The inflorescence stalk flattens and forms a platform or dome known as a receptacle, and then all of these tiny flowers are attached to it. But those tiny flowers taken together superficially look like a single whole flower. And so you hear the word capitulum, which is simply Latin for head. Think about the word capital, like head of state, or decapitate, like off with your head. So capitulum is the type of inflorescence in the Asteraceae. It simply means head. The other term you'll often hear is pseudanthemum, which simply means false flower. And that's just telling you that this entire inflorescence resembles a single flower. And the idea is that this condensed arrangement of flowers, which I talked about as being a trend in the Aster order, the Asteraceae, is really geared towards very efficient attraction for pollinators. So a pollinator can land in one place and without moving, move its little proboscis, its mouth part, and go boop, 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 and visit all these flowers and get a whole bunch of pollination done without having to flit from flower to flower. And so it allows, it's basically like when they condense things on a conveyor belt so that things are really close together, and it makes it super easy for the person manning the conveyor belt to get the work done. Okay, so here's some different views that I took of our common beach dune sunflower, Helianthus debilis. So this is an inflorescence called a capitulum or head. So here you can see the underside, and what you see is there's these rows of bracts called the Filleries that are underneath the head. And then on the outside of the head, we have these things that look like petals, but each of these is an individual flower called a ray flower. And then I took a pair of clippers and I cut this inflorescence in half so you could see, and I took a photo. And now you can see the individual disc flowers with the ovule, the immature seed at the base. And then you can see the corolla, the petal parts, and then you can see the reproductive parts up at the top. And you can even see the white receptacle or platform at the base. So this is the inflorescence structure that you see throughout the Aster family, is various types of capitula. Sometimes they don't have the ray flowers. Sometimes they have different kinds of flowers, and we'll talk about that. But overall, they always have a condensed structure subtended by bracts called Filleries attached to a platform or dome known as a receptacle. Okay, so the Filleries, as I said, are bracts, and the function is they protect the flower, the inflorescence, when it's in bud. They protect the developing capitulum. And there can be one row of Filleries, like you see in this tassel flower, There can be 2 rows of flowers like you see in this Gynura, where you see 1 long row and 1 short row, or you can have multiple overlapping rows like you see in these 2 photos on the bottom left. So that will be uniseriate, 1 series or whorl of Filleries, biseriate for 2 whorls, or multiple seriate, multiseriate for many whorls. And again, the function to these is protecting the capitulum, the inflorescence, while it is developing. The entire set of Filleries is collectively referred to as an involucre. And the arrangement, the form, and the dimensions of the Filleries are super useful for the purposes of ID. And the reason I'm telling you this is people always take photos of Asteraceae and send them to me for ID, and they just take 1 picture from above looking downward, and then I can't see the Filleries. And so I'm telling you this now. Think about if I tried to photograph all 4 of these plants in this slide from above, you wouldn't be able to see how many rows of Filleries and what shape they are. So when photographing a member of the Aster family for ID purposes, you want to get a side view like these 4 images so you can see the arrangement and the dimensions of the Filleries. Okay, fun fact, I love this. The guy who invented Velcro was a Swiss engineer named George de Mestral, who loved to hunt in the Alps with his dog Milka. And his dog, every time they went hunting, would get all of these fruiting structures from the burdock plant, which is in the Aster family, would get embedded in Milka's fur. And he would find them so hard to pull out of Milka's fur. And he said, why is this? So he looked at these Filleries of the fruiting head underneath a microscope, and he saw these hooked tips to the Filleries, and he had an aha moment. He said, oh, I could create a product where I had 1 surface with a hooked tip and another surface with a matted fur, and voila. Velcro was invented in 1840. So Asteraceae was directly involved as the inspiration for Velcro. That's very cool, right? That's something I just learned on this presentation. Okay, when we're looking at the Aster family, I mentioned in those capitula or heads that you can have different types of florets. Those are the individual flowers. You can have disc florets, which tend to be tubular in shape. They're radially symmetrical, which means you can't just cut them in half and get 2 equal sides. You have to slice them in a round section like you're slicing a pie. They have a 5-lobed apex, and they're bisexual, which means they have the female parts shown here in blue and the male parts, the anthers, in yellow. Then you have the ray florets. Those are the ones on the edges. They have a flattened strap-like corolla. They are bilaterally symmetrical, which means you can slice it down the middle and get 2 equal halves. The apex of the ray florets is 3-lobed. And these, you see no boy parts. You don't see any anthers here. You just see the female part. So they are pistillate, only female, or they're sterile. They don't have any sexual parts at all. And then the one other type of floret you commonly see is called ligulite. And they look a lot like a ray floret. But notice the difference here. They do have boy parts, whereas the ray flowers don't have boy parts. They're female or sterile. And also, when you look at this strap-shaped corolla, it typically has a 5-lobed apex. Okay, so 3 types of florets making up the capitulum. I would be remiss if I said there were really only 3. There are some other members of the Aster family that actually have bilabiate or two-lipped florets, but very, very few of them occur in North America or in cultivation in Florida. And so really you can break it down to these three as being the predominant types of tiny flowers that you see in a head. And so the way these florets are arranged in the head is you can just have a couple per head, like you see in the Solidago, or you can have many per head, like you see in this marigold. But what you always have is this arrangement where the flowers that open or mature first are on the outside edge and they mature inward, and that is called centripetal, as opposed to a centrifuge that spins things and swings it outward. The flowers mature in the Aster family from the outside to the inside. In other words, it's indeterminate. There is a large number of flowers continuing to be developed as it moves towards the center. The other thing is you'll notice is sometimes in the Asteraceae, you can have a single capitulum or head like you do in marigolds, or you can have a complex inflorescence, a compound structure like in this cudweed, where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, a whole bunch of heads really tightly arrayed on this stalk right here, or in the goldenrod, we have this diffuse branch structure. So all these different types of ways that the capitula or heads can be arranged, sometimes just one, sometimes many. And then the heads, depending on what type of florets they contain, can be classified as ligulate, discoid, or ray heads, or capitula, or inflorescences. So here are some examples of ligulite heads. And remember, the ligulate florets are bisexual. They have both male and female parts. They're bilaterally symmetrical, like you see here. So you can cut these straps down the middle and get 2 even sides. They tend to have these showy petal-like ligules, and bisexual, strap shape, bilateral. That pretty much covers it. And so these include things like the familiar dandelions, our sow thistles, lettuce, chicory, the tuberous vegetable called salsify, our common weed Youngia japonica, the false or Asiatic hawksbeard, the Stokes aster. All of these are types of asters that have a ligulate head. To figure out a ligulate head, you pretty much see one type of floret, not two, and look for 5 points at the top of that strap-like ligule, and it will tell you you have a ligulate head. Now, for a discoid head, only has discoid flowers. And remember, the discoid flower is the one that tends to be tubular in shape with 5 triangular lobes at the top, which you're kind of seeing here in this liatris, the 5 lobes at the top. And they are bisexual with both male and female parts and radially symmetrical. So discoid heads only have discoid florets. And some common examples would be the azuratum, our native blue mistflower conoclinium, the thistles like you see here, the tassel flowers, the ironweeds, saltbush, all of the eupatoriums or bone sets, the liatris, and so on. They all have those discoid heads. And then last but not least is the classic daisy, which has a radiate head. And those are the ones that have ray flowers on the outside and disc flowers in the center. So if I look here, you can see this discoid inflorescence, and then you see that the middle of this Tithonia flower, it kind of looks like a discoid inflorescence, but you just added on the ray flowers around the edge. And remember, these ray flowers are not petals. Those are individual florets that are either female or sterile. And so what you can see is sometimes those ray flowers are really densely arranged, and sometimes you just have a few of them on the outside. And I love this photo right here because you can really see how the disc flowers in the center are kind of tubular with the 5 lobes at the top. Okay, so examples of things that have a radiate head include the classic sunflower, the cone flowers, the Gaillardias or blanket flowers, the Gerber daisies, the Shasta daisies, the Mexican flame vines, Bidens, China asters. So many of our classic common daisies are a radiate type of capitulum or inflorescence. Okay, so just to recap, you have 3 primary types of florets or individual flowers: the ligulate floret, the disc floret, and the ray floret. And then those are combined into heads or inflorescences with the filleries on the outside, a platform or dome-like receptacle, and then those tiny flowers are arranged into either ligulate heads like in lettuce, a discoid head like an ironweed, or a radiate head like a sunflower. Okay. The other thing I mentioned in the Asteraceae, the Aster order, that you commonly have this secondary presentation of pollen, which means instead of the boy parts, the anthers, being exposed and exposing the pollen themselves to the environment, the anthers in the Asteraceae form a tube. They're kind of fused together, and they shed the pollen inward where it is not readily apparent to the environment. And what happens is when they shed the pollen, the female part that is emerging off the ovary here, this is known as the style emerges like a piston up in between this tube of anthers with little brush-like hairs on it, picks up all the pollen and moves the pollen up to the environment. So what is presenting the pollen for pollinators to collect is not the anthers or male parts, but the female parts. And that is unusual in the plant world. Usually the boy parts are doing their own business, but in the Aster family, the girl parts are doing the heavy lifting. And so what you can see here is a progression, 1, 2, 3, 4, of how there's the anthers. The anthers are starting to produce the pollen, but they're doing it on the inside surface of this tube. And then the female part is emerging, collecting the pollen, and then spreading apart. And the reason that it does this is to prevent outcrossing. So the male and female parts, the male parts are ready first and the female parts after, and that ensures genetic fitness, having outcrossing. So you're preventing self-fertilization. And there is a guy named Matt Candice who's has this fabulous website called In Defense of Plants. I hope a lot of you are familiar with it. And Matt has this wonderful explanation, including a little brief animated video of this pollination, the secondary presentation of pollen. And so here's a link if you want to go find out more about it. This type of secondary presentation of pollen is sometimes called plunger pollination because you have the female parts acting like a piston or plunger, bringing the pollen out from the tube of anthers. And it's also sometimes called brush pollination because the undersides of the stigma have these little hairs that are brushing up and then bringing out the pollen. So just another illustration. This is one of my photos of the native Varichia that grows on the coast. And what I want you to see here is the brown part is that tube of anthers. And what you can see with number 1 is that the style is just starting to push the pollen out of the tube. And then in number 2, you can see the arms of the style are starting to spread apart, and all these little grains of pollen are caught on the hairs on the underside. And then in number 3, the styler arms have actually spread apart and are curling under. And this is when the stigma, the female part, is actually receptive. And notice how we're moving from the outside to the inside. So this is this centripetal maturation that I mentioned. The florets in the middle are nowhere near mature. The first ones to mature are on the outside, and then the next row in, and then the next row, and so on.
Hey, Mark.
Yes.
I wanted to let you know that we're at 2 o'clock.
Okay.
And that's fine. And then I wanted to know a little bit about where the nectar was in that flower.
The nectar is at the very base, right by the ovary.
Okay. All right.
Okay. 2 more points. Asteraceae is fabulous for pollinators. The overwhelming majority of aster species are pollinated by insects, with just a handful, about 20 are pollinated by birds, a little more than 20 pollinated by mammals like bats, or sometimes small mammals like shrews or rodents. And there are some that are pollinated by wind, but overwhelmingly by insects. And these tend to be non-specialized. So in other families, like the orchid family, you have these highly specialized flowers that only allow one kind of insect to have access, but that is not very common in the Aster family. They're usually wide open and available. So then you get this whole array of bees, wasps, butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, ants, and more that can pollinate flowers. And often those disc flowers are touch sensitive, so that when an insect lands on that discoid part of the head, that it will actually trigger that plunger pollination, so that the pollen will be ejected out for that visiting pollinator. Okay, the aster fruit. Something interesting that's happening with the aster fruit is that the calyx, which you usually see below the flower, is modified into this structure called a pappus. And you guys are familiar with a pappus from blowing on a dandelion, right? And the pappus is a modification of the flower that scales, bristles, or hairs that help to disperse the seed on wind currents. So you can see the pappus attached by a stalk in this case, and the seed, or really the fruit with the seed inside at the base. And in this case, we've got a pappus directly attached to the fruit or achene, no stalk involved. This should look familiar to you, the bidens at the bottom. And here you can see the distinctive type of fruit, which is known as an achene. This is a dry fruit, not fleshy. It doesn't split open at maturity, and it contains a single seed. So that's what an achene is: dry, not splitting open, single seeded. And the seed wall is more or less separate from the seed itself, which means you can crack it open and get the seed out, as opposed to grasses or sedges, which have a similar type of fruit, but in both of those, the outer wall tends to be really stuck and attached to the seed. In the Asteraceae, it's easily separated, which you guys have all done with cracking a sunflower seed in your mouth. And the achenes themselves are often flattened or winged, which helps with wind dispersal, or sometimes spiny, like in the bidens, which will help with animal dispersal. Aster family has a million different uses. So lots of food plants, lots of culinary and medicinal herbs. There are several that yield seeds used for oil, several used for dyes. pyrethrum and fleabane used as insect repellents. And since I mentioned chemistry, an enormous number that are used in the pharmaceutical industry. And asters are a ubiquitous component of our cultivated landscape. There is an aster for almost every growing condition, from sunny to shade to dry to wet. Many of the asters are well adapted to semi-arid conditions, which makes them particularly good for Florida-friendly gardening, meaning they're drought tolerant once they are established. And they're fabulous for attracting a diversity of pollinators to your garden. So just quickly, native Asteraceae, many different beautiful ones to choose from. There are a whole bunch of weedy Asteraceae, which I'm sure all of you have been and will be pulling from your yards, and these should look familiar. There are 3 invasive Asteraceae I want you to be aware of: Woodelia and Praxalis. Praxalis has only been reported from Central Florida. These are both listed as invasive by the IFAS assessment, which means they're no-nos for us. And the coat buttons, Tridax procumbens, is actually listed as a noxious weed by the Department of Ag, which means it can't be sold or propagated in the state of Florida. So all of these are things you want to avoid. Then there's fabulous bedding annuals, a whole variety of beautiful perennials, some that just have fabulous foliage, so even without the flowers can be great interest. And I mentioned those African radiation of succulent types of species, which aren't so good in the landscape in wet Florida, but make great potted subjects or houseplants if you have a super sunny window or a grow light. And so now, if any of you guys have questions, I'm happy to address them.
Oh, we got questions, which is great. So Kathy wants to know, Kathy Hill, if there are more species of Asteraceae that are discovered, and you have inferred that they probably will be, would those species be newly discovered plants or plants being moved into Asteraceae? Are you thinking that they're going to be reclassified?
No. So what's happened is the Asteraceae, because of those heads, are so distinctive that there aren't many other things in other families that could be mistaken. So the family circumscription is really tight. So what's happening is people are moving into environments that maybe haven't been so well collected in the past and discovering things that don't appear to have been described before. The other thing is you can have certain groups where people lumped a bunch of things together, and then when they start doing DNA analysis, they might realize that what they treated previously as a couple of different varieties of a single species, or more appropriately distinguished as being separate species, and that's what leads to the increasing number of speciation. So it's both discovery of new species, particularly under collected habitats or under collected geographic areas, and also looking at problematic groups where a bunch of things were lumped together, but they seem kind of variable, and so those get busted up into separate species.
Great.
Very good question.
And hang on, someone mentioned the cudweed being the larval host plant for the American painted lady, I believe.
Oh, cool.
And
I did not know that.
Yeah, it is. And wondering if butterflies probably would be pollinating that. Wondering if those butterflies are eating it and pollinating it.
Okay, so what I'll tell you is that slide that I blasted through with the weeds. Remember, weed is the wrong plant in the wrong place. It's context. It's not that the plant is inherently bad. Like a lot of those things that I showed as weeds, like Biden's alba, they're native. And they have a great ecological function, which is often that they are providing food for pollinators. So the fact that we call them weeds does not imply that they're bad. It just means that they're growing sometimes in a place where they can be competitors with the things that we want to showcase in our landscape.
Right, right.
Right. And I just want to reinforce that just because I had those things on a slide as weeds does not imply that they don't have an ecological benefit, particularly in terms of attracting pollinators to your yard. So I've got a periphery of my yard where I let Biden's alba grow. But when it gets into
You're
my
a sick
landscape
man.
beds, watch out, I'm ripping that sucker out.
Yeah, I know. That's my cultivar. I have the white sunshine cultivar that I grow of the Biden's alba. So Mark, you're gonna have to help me with the names. Praxalis looks like Conoclindium.
It does.
How do you tell the difference? That's from
Praxalis has a leaf with a more pronounced toothed margin, a longer tapered tip, and it smells strongly like cat urine. Conoclinium tends to have rounder and shorter. If it does have pointed, they are shorter, not long lobes. The tip is not as long, and it does not have, it smells, but it has more of that spicy vanilla smell and not the cat urine smell. The other thing to know about Praxalis is it's only been reported in Central Florida from Marion County down to Manatee County. So if you're in the Panhandle or you're in South Florida, to date, Praxalis has not been reported. It is a whole group of contiguous states from Marion to Manatee, where so far Praxalis has been found.
Gosh, Mark, it sounds like maybe we could have a fact sheet or a blog post on seeing the differences between.
Yeah, I actually think that there is a fact sheet through FDAX already.
Okay, that would be great. Let's see, we have another question, and everybody's like, fabulous, this is awesome. I said I'm seeing so much Tridax right now that I am shocked about. The great question about could you recommend an aster that is always in flower, that seems to be really not seasonal, but just producing blooms a lot? And really what folks are thinking about is their pollinator garden.
Okay, so that is hard because I went to collect a bunch of asters so I could do macro photos like a lot of the photos I showed you.
Yeah, they were
And
great.
Youngia japonica, the Asiatic hawksbeard, nothing is in flower now because we had all this rain and a lot of these things are adapted to dry. And so I think of those as being, cudweed. There's no cudweed right now because it's been too wet. Normally, if we'd had a more normal summer, then I would be seeing those at this time of year. So it really depends on the climate in that particular year. One cultivated thing that I'll just tell you from experience, that African bush daisy, Euryopsis, I have that in my front yard. It's frost tolerant, so it doesn't freeze back in the winter. And it usually has at least several, if not many, flowers on it year round. And most of the African bush daisies that we have in Florida are hybrids. So they don't produce seed, which means I don't worry about them becoming invasive in Florida, but they're a source of pollen. So that would be.
And you do see pollinators on them? Because
yes.
The follow-up question is someone, and she said she sees a lot of bees on her gray leaf, and I'm not sure what gray leaf is.
Me neither.
And she sees bees on that, but she's got beach sunflower or dune sunflower,
which is great.
And seeing, great flowers, but not a whole lot of pollinators on it.
So I'll tell you, in the spring, well, actually, I don't even sow it. Tithonia, the Mexican sunflower, self-seeds in my ginormous front yard bed that Wendy's seen. Oh, and I kind of
Melochia.
Mexican sunflower. It is a magnet for pollinators of all kinds, at all times of day, morning, noon, into dusk. I am seeing pollinators on it, bees and butterflies. and it has a very long season. It's frost sensitive. So in North Florida, you can't do it in the winter. In South Florida, you could. And the foliage is looking ratty at this time of year. But particularly if you start deadheading it at the beginning of the season, it just keeps on trucking. And I've had Tithonia blooming in my front yard since March. We're into late September now, and it's covered. So it's a great warm season as well.
Yeah. So they said that the gray leaf is the Melotia.
Oh, Melotia is in the Malvaceae. That's the mallow family.
Okay. And Liza Ryan says her blue mist flower is usually constantly in bloom and is usually covered. So
And also great for pollinators as well, but tends to be seasonal flowering.
yeah. And Cheryl's wondering, is Zinnia in the Aster family?
Absolutely. And I did not mention Zinnia, but yes, they are that classic radiate with the ray flowers on the ray florets on the outside and the disc flowers in the middle. Very good observation. Thank you for catching that. I did not include Zinnia.
And Stokes, Liza also says her Stokes are always off and on in bloom. And that's
I wish I could grow Stokes. I don't know why I can't. I always plant them and they're not very perennial for me, but I think it's because my yard is really dense and crowded and they like having their own space.
right. And then Mary Hornock brings up an interesting question, wondering if the climate change is affecting Aster species being available to pollinators. I know that's kind of tangential, Mark, but any thoughts on that?
The only thing that I'll say is here in Florida, the implication is that we're going to see a longer warm season relative to the cool season, and we are going to see increased rainfall. And the longer warm season is probably beneficial in terms of pollinator access. But as I mentioned, there are a lot of weedy things like that Asiatic hawksbeard or the cudweed, which, you know, when there's too much rain, they're kind of like stop flowering until the soil dries out again. But, you know, Biden's is never without a flower, right? And so
Right.
Biden's, like when Florida is underwater, Biden's will still be a flowering and attracting the pollinators. We'll all be in rafts and Biden's will be sticking its heads above the water.
And eating it too, because it's somewhat edible, right? Gil Trengrove is, I'm very excited to ask you this question or to make share his comment with you. He said, Woodelia makes a great substitute for lawn as one can keep it mowed. Mark?
It does, but Woodelia is spreading into the wild. So there are undisturbed natural habitats where Woodelia is showing up. And that is what made the IFAS assessment determine that it's invasive and not recommended. So that means the plant police are not going to come to your yard and tell you to take Woodelia out of your yard, but you could not in good conscience call your yard Florida friendly, and you could not wear your master gardener hat and be promoting Woodelia to clients, because the UF-IFAS assessment has determined through a scientific evaluation that it is invasive. So be that as it may, and I don't dispute that it can be an interesting ground cover, but the concern is with its environmental consequences here in Florida.
Thank you, Mark. And then Michael, maybe we have this be the last question. Michael asks, can you recommend a few asters that are shade tolerant?
Oh boy. Well, mist flower can be kind of shade tolerant. Some of the ironweeds, the Vernonias, I see growing on like woodland edges. Wendy, do you have anything off the top of your head?
I do. I'm double checking it. Just checking, and you're going to say, why didn't I think of that? What about Farfugium?
Farfugium. Excellent. Yes. So it's a non-native but cultivated, very, very good for shade. Yeah, particularly part shade. So dense shade is challenging for many things, particularly like the flowering things. But, you know, I'm surprised how many comps or asters will do in a part shade environment. But for the things where you really want flower power, like your bedding kind of things, full sun will be best.
Yeah, right. I think Stokesia would also take a little bit of shade.
Yeah.
If it's appropriate in that area. I think that's about it. Diane Goldberg said, won't the longer warm season maybe help invasive exotics spread further north too? So
I think that's quite possible. A lot of it is us. A lot of the spread is humans and not nature. Humans are the primary introducer and spreader of invasive plants. And so that's why it's important for us to be good stewards as we maintain our landscape and educate the public.
Exactly. And just our last question is Elizabeth Morris asked for a link to Botany 101 that Marc teaches, which is almost a full day class of intense botanical training. And Elizabeth, I would suggest that you contact your local county agent to see if she could schedule Marc for that training, if that is something.
What county is she in?
He doesn't say.
Okay. Yeah, so usually I'm doing Botany 101 for new master gardener intakes, the interns, but some counties have gotten together and arranged like regional trainings. And so, yeah, get with your coordinator and tell them you're interested in Botany 101. I've done it for Northeast. I've done it for Central District and Southwest District, but I don't think I've done it for Northwest or Southeast.
Okay, and I promise this really will be the last question. Lynn asked, what is your favorite field guide for bringing out and doing on the fly wildflower plant ID?
Oh boy. Okay, so I'm a botanist, so I don't really use field guides. I'm a geek. So I tend to go straight to genus level, and then, or if I don't know genus, then I'm going to pluck a flower and bring it back and key it out. Jarrett Daniels has a good field guide, and it is arranged by family, I think.
It's not color coded.
David Hall has one that's color coded, and then Taylor has one that is arranged by habitat. So upland versus coastal versus forest versus marsh. So it kind of depends on what take you want to have on it. I'm going to step away from the screen for 1 second. If I was going to talk about any one book for the Aster family, this book, The Sunflower Family by Spellenberg and Zucker, just came out 2 years ago from Brit Press in Texas. And this is like the Aster family Bible that tells you all the tribes and how to recognize them and all these species. And it's just like a font of information. I used it very heavily to prepare for this presentation.
Hey, Marc, would you take a picture of that cover and include that in your slides and when you send us the PDF?
I will.
Okay, great. So it sounds like perhaps Palm Beach County is requesting the Botany 101, and Muriel said she could use a botany refresher too. So you all contact your agent.
To Emily and tell Emily that if she has got funding for travel and invite some of the neighboring counties, I would love to come down to Palm Beach County, particularly in the wintertime.
Exactly. Oh, wouldn't you love to go to the Norton Sculpture Garden down there, Marc?
There's so many things I want to go to in Southeast Florida. There's lots to do there.
Lots to do. All right, Marc Frank, thank you so much. This has been fantastic, and we really appreciate your expertise. I know it's a little bit up there for some of us, but it's good to train our brain like this also.
You guys, I know that I tend to be real sciencey and put it out there, but this is how you learn. And it's also like some of the most exciting ways to really understand what's going on in botany. So I try and bridge between my sciencey side and my gardener side to bring some of this to you. So I hope it motivates you to kind of look a little closer.
Great. Marc, somebody wants to know if you've been to Pan's Garden in Palm Beach.
Oh, I have not.
Okay. Then we've got to get in the car right now. All right, my friend, thank you so much. We'll see everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It was wonderful having you. I hope COVID's gone and I'm going to see you all in person soon.
Yes. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.